Number 1. Samantha Smith. The year was 1985, a time when the world held its breath, suspended in the icy grip of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union stood like two titans on the edge of a precipice, their nuclear arsenals casting a long, dark shadow over the future of humanity. Fear was the dominant currency of the era, a constant low-level hum in the background of everyday life. But amidst this geopolitical storm, a most unlikely beacon of hope emerged. She wasn't a diplomat, a politician, or a military strategist. She was a child. Her name was Samantha Smith, and for a brief, shining moment, she made the world believe that peace was not just a political talking point, but a tangible possibility. To understand the magnitude of the tragedy that befell her, we must first understand the height from which she fell. Samantha was just an ordinary schoolgirl from Manchester, Maine, until she wrote a simple, earnest letter to the Soviet leader, Yuri Andropov, asking him why he wanted to conquer the world. It was the kind of innocent question only a child could ask, yet it pierced through the Iron Curtain. To everyone's astonishment, Andropov replied. He invited her to the Soviet Union, and just like that, the Peace Girl was born. She became a global sensation, America's youngest ambassador, disarming the world with a smile that seemed to promise a better tomorrow. By the summer of 1985, Samantha had transcended her political fame and was beginning to carve out a new path in the glittering world of Hollywood. She had been cast in a new television series called Lime Street, starring alongside the legendary Robert Wagner. She was 13 years old, on the cusp of womanhood, with a future that seemed written in the stars. She had the poise of a diplomat and the charisma of a movie star. The world was watching her grow up, eager to see what this remarkable young woman would achieve. If you find yourself drawn to these forgotten stories of promise and tragedy, and you want to ensure these memories aren't lost to time, please take a moment to subscribe as we uncover the darkness behind the glamour. On August 25, 1985, that bright future was hurtling through the night sky. Samantha and her father, Arthur, were returning home to Maine after filming a segment for the show in London. They were tired, eager to see Samantha's mother, Jane, who was waiting for them at the arrival gate. They boarded Bar Harbor Airlines Flight 1808, a small Beechcraft 99 commuter plane. It was a short hop, a routine flight that they had likely taken many times before. But nature, indifferent to fame or destiny, was brewing a disaster. The night was pitch black, and a cold, driving rain was battering the coast of Maine. As the small plane began its descent toward the Auburn-Lewiston Municipal Airport, the visibility dropped to near zero. Inside the cabin of Flight 1808, the atmosphere would have been loud and unsettling. These small commuter planes offer little insulation from the roar of the engines or the turbulence of a storm. One can only imagine the final moments shared between Samantha and her father. Arthur Smith, a literature professor, had been her rock, her guide through the whirlwind of international fame. Now they sat side by side in the cramped fuselage, perhaps holding hands as the plane buffeted against the wind. Up in the cockpit, the situation was rapidly deteriorating. The two pilots, relatively young and operating under intense pressure, were flying into a void. The airport ahead lacked the sophisticated guidance systems found at major international hubs. They were relying on a non-precision instrument approach, a maneuver that demands absolute perfection from the pilots. But something was wrong. Whether it was a malfunction of the altimeter, a misreading of the instruments, or the insidious phenomenon known as spatial disorientation, the plane was not where it was supposed to be. In the aviation world, there is a terrifying concept called controlled flight into terrain. It happens when a perfectly airworthy aircraft, under the full control of the pilot, is flown inadvertently into the ground. The pilots believe they are safe. They believe they are on the correct path, right up until the moment of impact. As Flight 1808 dropped through the clouds, searching for the runway lights that would guide them home, they drifted too low. Much too low. The radar controller noticed the deviation, but the communication was spotty, the warnings lost in the static of the storm, or perhaps realized too late.
The majestic pines of the Maine wilderness reached up into the darkness, invisible obstacles in the flight path. There was no distress call, no final message of panic, just the roar of the engines fighting the storm, and then a violent, shattering interruption. The aircraft clipped the treetops nearly a mile short of the runway. At that speed, the trees didn't just break, they tore the delicate aluminum skin of the plane apart. The aircraft cartwheeled through the dense forest, the kinetic energy of the crash disintegrating the fuselage. It slammed into the muddy earth with a force that extinguished all hope in a fraction of a second. The resulting fireball illuminated the rainy woods, a gruesome beacon that signaled the end of a short, extraordinary life. Back at the terminal, Jane Smith waited. The scheduled arrival time came and went. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until the flashing lights of emergency vehicles confirmed the nightmare that every waiting relative dreads.
The recovery efforts were grim. The crash site was a scene of total devastation, the wreckage scattered among the charred timber. There were no survivors. All 6 passengers and 2 crew members had perished instantly. When the news broke, it felt as though the entire world had been punched in the gut. This wasn't just a plane crash, it felt like the death of innocence itself. In the Soviet Union, people wept openly in the streets. In the United States, flags were lowered to half-staff. President Ronald Reagan sent his condolences to Jane Smith, writing, "Perhaps you can take some measure of comfort in the knowledge that millions of Americans, indeed millions of people, share the burden of your grief." Even Mikhail Gorbachev sent a personal message, a testament to the bridge Samantha had built between the 2 superpowers. The investigation that followed pointed to pilot error, a tragic miscalculation of altitude in poor weather. But for the public, the technical details offered little solace. Conspiracy theories naturally bloomed in the fertile ground of Cold War paranoia. Some whispered the KGB had sabotaged the plane. Others blamed the CIA. But the truth was far more mundane and far more cruel. It was simply a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment on a rainy night that robbed the world of a potential leader, a peacemaker, or perhaps a brilliant actress. We will never know what Samantha Smith would have become. We only know her as the 13-year-old girl who looked at the world with clear eyes and asked for peace. Her funeral was attended by thousands. The image of her grieving mother, standing alone where a family of 3 should have stood, became a searing emblem of loss. The role she had filmed for Lime Street was dedicated to her memory, a ghostly performance that aired posthumously, reminding viewers of the vibrant talent that had been snuffed out. Samantha's death serves as a brutal reminder that fame, purpose, and global adoration offer no protection against the indifferent laws of physics. She was a passenger on a machine that failed to find the Earth safely, and in that failure, a light went out. But while Samantha Smith's death was a public tragedy played out on the world stage, our next story takes us to a different kind of silence. We move from the cold forests of Maine to the rugged, sun-drenched canyons of California, where a man who had spent his life defining the emotional sound of Hollywood, giving a voice to sinking ships and blue aliens, took to the skies alone, only to vanish into the wilderness, leaving behind a silence that was deafening. Number 2. James Horner. If the previous tragedy was about the silencing of a future voice, this next loss was the silencing of a voice that had already defined the emotional landscape of a generation. We often worship the faces on the screen, the actors who weep, fight, and love in close-up, but we rarely think about the invisible hand that tells us how to feel. James Horner was that invisible hand. He was the emotional architect behind the biggest blockbusters in history. When you think of the haunting vocals of Titanic, the tribal drums of Avatar, or the soaring bagpipes of Braveheart, you are hearing the soul of James Horner. He was a man who lived his professional life in dark, soundproof studios, meticulously conducting orchestras to manipulate the heartstrings of millions. But outside the studio, he sought a very different kind of conduction. He sought the raw, unscripted freedom of the sky. Horner was not a casual hobbyist. He was an obsessive, experienced pilot with thousands of hours in the cockpit. Flying was his sanctuary,
a place where the only noise was the hum of the engine and the wind over the wings, far removed from the pressures of Hollywood deadlines. On the morning of June 22, 2015, the 61-year-old composer arrived at an airfield in Camarillo, California. The sky was a piercing blue, the kind of California morning that begs for flight. He wasn't climbing into a luxury jet or a comfortable Cessna. He strapped himself into a short Tucano, a high-performance two-seat turboprop military trainer. It was a beast of a machine, agile and fast, painted with a distinctive P-40 Warhawk shark mouth on the nose. It was a plane built for precision and adrenaline, traits that mirrored the man flying it. He took off alone, leaving the complexity of his musical scores on the ground, ascending into the simplicity of the air. He headed north toward the Los Padres National Forest, a rugged, desolate expanse of dry riverbeds and scrub brush. To the radar controllers and the few people on the ground, it was just another plane in the vast American sky. But inside that cockpit, a tragedy was beginning to unfold, one that would cut short a symphony midway through its final movement. Horner was flying for the sheer joy of it, but in aviation, the line between joy and disaster is often measured in inches and seconds. As Horner pushed the Tucano deeper into the wilderness, he entered the Quatal Canyon. This area is a playground for skilled pilots, a place where the terrain rises and falls in dramatic waves, offering a visceral sense of speed. It creates a canyon run, a high-stakes gauntlet where the pilot weaves through the geography. It is exhilarating, hypnotic, and undeniably dangerous. Witnesses later reported seeing the aircraft flying low, hugging the contours of the Earth. There is a psychological state known as flow, often achieved by musicians in the heat of performance and pilots in the thrill of flight. It is a state of total absorption. It is likely Horner was in this state, dancing with the canyon walls, the world narrowing down to the instrument panel and the horizon. But the Tucano is a fast aircraft, and the Quatal Canyon is unforgiving. At low altitudes, the margin for error evaporates. You cannot pause, you cannot rewind, and you cannot edit the take. The data later recovered suggested that Horner was performing maneuvers, perhaps enjoying the G-force, feeling the responsiveness of the aircraft. But then, the geometry of the flight path clashed with the geometry of the Earth. Whether it was a momentary distraction, a mechanical hiccup, or simply a misjudgment of the canyon's rising floor, the math stopped working. The end came with shocking violence. The aircraft, traveling at high speed, impacted the ground in a remote section of the canyon. The crash was catastrophic. The plane fragmented upon impact, creating a crater in the dry earth and sparking a brush fire that sent a plume of black smoke drifting lazily into the clear sky. There was no radio distress call, no mayday. One moment, there was the roar of a turboprop engine echoing off the canyon walls. The next, there was only the crackle of flames and the returning silence of the desert. The violence of the crash was so extreme that immediate identification was impossible. When the first responders arrived, fighting through the brush fire, they found only debris. The man who had given the world the soundtrack to its greatest romances and tragedies was gone, consumed by the very landscape he loved to explore. The news trickled out slowly, initially as a rumor of a famous pilot down in Santa Barbara. When James Horner's name was confirmed, the shockwave hit Hollywood with the force of an earthquake. Directors like James Cameron and Ron Howard were devastated. They hadn't just lost a colleague, they had lost a collaborator who could translate their visions into sound. Celine Dion, whose career was defined by Horner's "My Heart Will Go On," spoke of a profound emptiness. It felt impossible that a man who commanded such immense creative power could be extinguished so randomly, so quietly, in a dry riverbed miles from civilization. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation eventually concluded that the crash was likely due to the pilot's inability to maintain clearance from the terrain while maneuvering at low altitude. In layman's terms, he had simply flown too close to the edge. It was a pilot error, a human mistake made by a man who was otherwise a master of precision. The irony was bitter. In the recording studio, Horner had complete control over every variable, every note,
every second of silence. In the cockpit, amidst the chaotic variables of the real world, he had lost control of the only thing that mattered: his altitude. His death left a void in the industry that has yet to be filled. Films that were slated for his touch had to find new voices, but the Horner sound, that unique blend of choral voices and swelling strings, remains a ghost in the machine of modern cinema. He died doing what he loved, but he died alone, a solitary figure in a vast landscape. However, while James Horner's final resting place was found in the scorched earth of California, our next case involves a legend who vanished into a much colder, darker abyss. We leave the sun-drenched canyons for the gray, fog-choked skies of World War II Europe, where the biggest musical star of the 1940s boarded a plane to cross the English Channel and simply ceased to exist, leaving behind no wreckage, no body, and a mystery that has baffled investigators for over 80 years. Number 3. Glenn Miller. The English Channel is a cold, unforgiving stretch of water, a turbulent gray divide that has swallowed sailors, aviators, and secrets for centuries. But in the winter of 1944, it was more than just a body of water. It was a theater of war. The skies above it were a chaotic highway of bombers and fighters, a place where death could come from an enemy ace, a mechanical failure, or the weather itself. It is here, in this freezing, fog-bound abyss, that Hollywood and the music industry lost their brightest star in a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. We are talking about Major Alton Glenn Miller, the man who didn't just play the soundtrack of World War II, he was the soundtrack. If you were alive in the 1940s, Glenn Miller was inescapable. He was the most famous band leader in the world, a man whose trombone had a velvety golden tone that offered comfort to a world on fire. He was a movie star, featuring in hits like Sun Valley Serenade, where his music was the true leading man. But Miller was a patriot first. At the height of his fame, earning thousands of dollars a week, he walked away from it all to join the Army Air Forces. His mission was simple but vital: to modernize the Army band and boost the morale of the troops fighting in Europe. By December 1945, he was in England preparing to take his Army Air Force band to Paris, a city recently liberated from Nazi control. He wanted to give the exhausted soldiers a Christmas concert they would never forget. On December 15, 1944, the weather at RAF Twinwood Farm in Bedfordshire was atrocious. A thick, soupy fog clung to the ground, and the temperature was freezing. Most flights were grounded, but Miller was impatient. He was a perfectionist, anxious to get to Paris ahead of his band to arrange the logistics for the holiday broadcast. He refused to wait. Around 1:55 p.m., he boarded a small, single-engine UC-64 Norseman aircraft. It was a utilitarian plane, not designed for comfort, and certainly not designed for the heavy icing conditions reported over the channel. As he climbed into the passenger seat, Miller reportedly turned to the pilot, John Morgan, and nervously joked, "Where the hell are the parachutes?" The pilot, trying to lighten the mood, replied, "What's the matter, Miller? Do you want to live forever?" The engine sputtered to life, a lonely coughing sound in the damp air, and the small plane taxied into the mist. It lifted off, swallowed almost instantly by the low-hanging clouds, heading south toward a destiny that would become folklore. Once the Norseman disappeared into the soup, as pilots called the thick fog, it entered a void of silence. There was no radar tracking for small liaison aircraft in 1944. They were flying on visual flight rules, in conditions that offered no visuals. As the minutes turned into hours, the band members waiting in Paris began to worry. The flight from England to France is short, a mere hop across the water, but the sky remained empty. When the sun set and the plane had not arrived, the anxiety turned into a cold dread. Back in England, the ground crews hoped they had turned back or landed in a field, but as the days passed, the reality set in. The most famous musician in the world had simply vanished. The theories surrounding the disappearance of Glenn Miller are as numerous as they are haunting. The official inquiry concluded that the most likely cause was a combination of pilot error and mechanical failure. The Norseman was prone to carburetor icing, a deadly condition where ice builds up in the engine's air intake, choking the engine until it seizes. In the freezing moisture over the channel, flying low to see the water, the plane could have turned into a flying block of ice, dropping into the waves before the pilot could even transmit a distress signal. But there is another, darker theory that has persisted for decades, supported by logbooks and eyewitness testimony from returning bomber crews. On that same afternoon, a squadron of British Lancaster bombers was returning from an aborted raid on Germany. They were carrying full payloads of bombs that were too dangerous to land with. As was standard procedure, they were ordered to jettison their bombs into a designated drop zone in the English Channel before landing. The navigator of one of those Lancasters later claimed that as they released their thousands of pounds of explosives, he looked down through the clouds and saw a small, single-engine aircraft flying below them. He watched in horror as the plane was caught in the shock waves and the geysers of water erupting from the sea, spiraling uncontrollably into the depths. Was Glenn Miller the victim of a tragic friendly fire incident? Did he die not by the hand of the enemy or the weather, but by the sheer, chaotic coincidence of war? The news of his disappearance was withheld until Christmas Eve 1944 to avoid devastating the morale of the troops during the holiday. When it was finally announced, the shock was universal. It was as if a light had gone out in the cultural consciousness of America. General Jimmy Doolittle, the aviation hero, told Miller's band that Captain Miller has not returned. The band, heartbroken, played the Christmas concert without him. They placed a single microphone at the center of the stage, leaving it empty, while they played Moonlight Serenade to a weeping audience of soldiers. It remains one of the most poignant moments in entertainment history. To this day, not a single scrap of the Norseman aircraft, nor the body of Glenn Miller, has ever been found. The English Channel is a vast, shifting graveyard, and it keeps its secrets well. Miller was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star, and his music became immortal, a timeless loop of brass and melody that outlived the man who created it. But the lack of closure haunts the narrative. There was no funeral, no gravesite, no final goodbye. He simply walked into the fog and ceased to exist. For his fans and for his grieving widow Helen, he remained perpetually missing in action, a ghost lost in the gray static of the war. His death marked the end of the big band era, a symbolic closing of a chapter. The world moved on, the war ended, and rock and roll was born. But the mystery of Flight 777 remains a chilling reminder of how fragile even the biggest icons are when suspended thousands of feet above a freezing ocean. We leave the cold, gray mystery of the European theater now, but the shadow of aviation tragedy stretches far and wide. We travel south, leaving the icy waters of the Channel for the heat and passion of Latin America, where a man who was not just a star, but a king, the absolute monarch of Mexican cinema, would meet a fiery end that didn't just cause grief, it caused an entire nation to shut down in a collective scream of disbelief.
Number 4. Pedro Infante. In the pantheon of cinema legends, there are stars, there are icons, and then there is Pedro Infante. To call him the Elvis Presley of Mexico would be an understatement. He was the soul of a nation, the golden voice of the golden age of Mexican cinema. He was the charro who sang with the passion of the common man, the actor who could make you laugh and weep in the same scene. He had filmed over 60 movies and recorded hundreds of songs, weaving himself into the very DNA of Latin American culture. But Pedro had a vice, a dangerous love affair that rivaled his love for the camera. He was obsessed with flying. He wasn't just a passenger, he was a pilot, accumulating nearly 3,000 flight hours. He loved the freedom of the skies, perhaps because it was the only place where he wasn't mobbed by adoring fans. But aviation had already tried to kill him twice. He had survived 2 serious crashes in previous years, one leaving him with a metal plate in his skull, yet his passion remained undimmed. He famously said, "God loves me, he won't let me die in a plane." On the morning of April 15, 1957, that faith would be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. Pedro was in Mérida, Yucatan, desperate to get back to Mexico City to contest a legal annulment of his marriage. All the commercial flights were full. Impatient and determined, he pulled rank. He convinced a local cargo airline, TAMSA, to let him co-pilot a converted B-24 Liberator bomber that was hauling a shipment of fish and fabrics to the capital. It was a heavy 4-engine beast of a plane, a relic of World War II, not designed for nimble maneuvers. Pedro climbed into the cockpit alongside Captain Victor Vidal. It was barely 7:30 in the morning. The sun was just beginning to bake the Yucatan Peninsula as the massive engines roared to life. Pedro, the idol of millions, was now just a man wrestling with a machine. As they taxied down the runway, the aircraft was heavy, laden with cargo and fuel. They lifted off, the wheels leaving the tarmac, and for a brief moment, everything seemed normal. But gravity is a patient hunter, and on that bright April morning, it was waiting.
Within minutes of takeoff, the Liberator began to struggle. It had barely climbed to 200 meters when the number 2 engine failed. Then the number 1 engine faltered. The plane, heavy and now underpowered on one side, entered a violent, uncontrollable spin. Witnesses on the ground, people in the bustling streets of Mérida who were starting their day, looked up in horror as the massive silver bird shuddered and banked sharply. It wasn't a slow glide, it was a stone dropping from the sky. The plane plummeted into a densely populated neighborhood, smashing directly into a house. The impact was apocalyptic. The fuel tanks, filled for the long journey to Mexico City, ignited instantly. An inferno engulfed the crash site, consuming the plane, the house, and a nearby store. The heat was so intense that it melted the metal of the aircraft and fused it with the rubble of the building. Pedro Infante, the man whose face was known to every household in Mexico, was gone in a flash of blinding light. He was 39 years old. The violence of the crash was total. Identification of the bodies was only possible through the gold bracelet Pedro always wore and the metal plate in his skull from his previous crash. The news spread like a shockwave, faster than the telegraphs could carry it. Pedro Infante is dead. It was a sentence that refused to be processed. It felt like a national lie. How could the man who played the immortal hero Pepe el Toro be reduced to ash in a random street in Mérida? The reaction was unprecedented. It wasn't just grief, it was hysteria. Thousands of people poured into the streets, weeping openly. Radio stations suspended their programming to play his songs on a loop, a mournful soundtrack that echoed across the entire continent. His funeral in Mexico City was a scene of chaos and sorrow that has rarely been equaled. Over 300,000 people lined the streets to bid farewell to their idol. The police were overwhelmed, people fainted, barriers were crushed, and the collective wail of the crowd drowned out the engines of the hearse. It was a day of national mourning, not by decree, but by the sheer will of the people. To this day, on the anniversary of his death, crowds still gather at his grave, singing Amorcito Corazón, refusing to let the memory of their king fade. The investigation cited engine failure and cargo shifts as the probable cause, but for the people of Mexico, the technical details were irrelevant. They had lost their voice. Pedro Infante had survived poverty, he had survived fame, and he had survived 2 previous crashes, but his third dance with death was one too many. He died as he lived, fast, fiery, and in the spotlight of history. But while Pedro Infante was the king of the talking pictures, our next tragedy takes us back to a time when cinema had no voice at all.
we travel back to the dawn of Hollywood, to the silent era, where a man who taught the world how to dance, a superstar who defined elegance and grace for the Edwardian age, traded his tuxedo for a flight suit and flew straight into a disaster that would become one of the first grim chapters in Hollywood's Book of the Dead.
Number 5. Vernon Castle. Before the talkies, before the Technicolor musicals, and before the modern celebrity even existed, there was Vernon Castle. In the 1910s, he and his wife Irene were not just famous, they were a cultural phenomenon. They were the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers of the silent era, the couple who taught the world to dance. They introduced the foxtrot, the tango, and the castle walk to America, turning ballroom dancing from a scandalous pastime into a refined art. They were the epitome of grace, style, and Edwardian elegance. But when World War I erupted, Vernon, a British citizen, didn't hide behind his fame. He felt a call to duty that was louder than the applause. He traded his tailcoat for a flight suit and joined the Royal Flying Corps. He wasn't just a figurehead. He flew over 150 combat missions over the Western Front, shooting down German aircraft and earning the Croix de Guerre for bravery. He survived the meat grinder of aerial combat in Europe, a place where the life expectancy of a pilot was measured in weeks, and returned to America a hero. He was sent to Texas to train the next generation of pilots, a job that was supposed to be safe. It was the victory lap of a war hero. On February 15, 1918, Vernon was at Carruthers Field near Fort Worth, taking up a student pilot for a routine training flight. The war was raging across the ocean, but the Texas sky was clear. He was flying a Curtiss JN-4 Jenny, a biplane made of wood and fabric. It should have been an uneventful morning, but as they were coming in for a landing, another aircraft, flown by a student who was unaware of his surroundings, took off directly into their path. It was a moment of pure, terrifying geometry. A collision was imminent. In that split second, Vernon Castle had a choice. He could have pulled up, potentially saving himself, but likely slicing through the other aircraft with his propeller, killing the student in the other plane and possibly his own passenger. Or he could sacrifice the altitude he didn't have. Relying on the reflexes that had made him a dance legend and a combat ace, Vernon executed a violent Immelman turn, a desperate acrobatic maneuver to vault over the other plane. He cleared the student's aircraft by mere feet, but the maneuver bled off all his speed. His plane stalled. The Jenny shuddered and dropped like a stone from an altitude of just 50 feet. There was no time to recover. The nose of the aircraft slammed into the hard Texas dirt. The wooden frame splintered instantly. The student in the back seat, an American cadet named Edwin Peters, survived with bruises. But Vernon, sitting in the exposed front cockpit, bore the brunt of the impact. The engine was pushed back into the cockpit, crushing the man who had once glided so effortlessly across the world's ballrooms. He died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, without ever regaining consciousness. The irony was cruel and absolute. He had danced with death in the skies over France, dodging bullets and flak for years, only to be killed in a training accident in Texas to save the life of a novice. His funeral in New York City was a massive event, the streets lined with thousands of silent mourners. Irene, his partner in life and dance, was devastated. The castle walk had ended. He was only 30 years old. Vernon Castle's death was one of the first major celebrity casualties of the aviation age. It signaled a dark truth that Hollywood would learn over and over again in the coming century. The sky does not care how famous you are. It doesn't care if you are a war hero, a dancer, or a king. It only respects the laws of aerodynamics. Vernon's sacrifice is often forgotten today, overshadowed by the stars of the sound era. But he remains the original fallen idol, the first star to be plucked from the firmament by a flying machine. His death was a tragic accident of wartime training, a selfless act of heroism. But our next story leaps forward into the modern era, to a tragedy that was neither an accident nor a random act of nature.
It was a calculated act of war on a Tuesday morning that changed the world forever. We move from the dusty airfields of 1918 Texas to the clear blue skies of New York City in September 2001. There, a man who had spent his career crafting laughter for millions, the creator of the most successful sitcoms in television history, found himself aboard a flight that would become a weapon in the deadliest terror attack in human history.
Number 6. David Angell. Laughter is a universal language, and for nearly 2 decades, David Angell spoke it more fluently than anyone else in Hollywood. If you sat down in front of a television in the 1980s or 90s, you were likely watching something that sprang from his mind. He was the architectural genius behind Cheers, the show that made a bar feel like home, and the co-creator of Frasier, the sophisticated, witty spin-off that became one of the most acclaimed sitcoms in history. Angell wasn't just a writer, he was a titan of the industry, a man who had mastered the art of the perfect punchline. He had won multiple Emmy Awards and had brought joy to millions of living rooms across the globe. He was at the absolute pinnacle of his career, a sitcom king whose reign seemed destined to last for years. On the morning of September 11, 2001, David and his wife of 30 years, Lynn Sweeney, were at Logan International Airport in Boston. They were heading to Los Angeles for the Emmy Awards, where Frasier was once again a contender. It was a crisp, clear Tuesday morning, the kind of day pilots call severe clear because the visibility is unlimited. The Angells boarded American Airlines Flight 11, settling into their seats in first class, row 8. They were seasoned travelers, accustomed to the luxury and routine of coast-to-coast flights. As the Boeing 677 pushed back from the gate at 7:40 a.m., the mood was calm. Coffee was being served. Newspapers were being read. It was the mundane beginning to a day that would end the world as we knew it. David Angell was a man who dealt in structure. The setup, the conflict, the resolution. That is the rhythm of comedy. But as Flight 11 climbed over the Massachusetts countryside, the script of reality was rewritten by chaos. 14 minutes into the flight, the plane stopped responding to air traffic control. The transponder was turned off. The routine hum of the journey was shattered not by mechanical failure, but by human malevolence. 5 hijackers who had been sitting just rows away from the Angells seized control of the cockpit. The plane, which had been a vessel of commerce and connection, was instantly transformed into a guided missile loaded with 10,000 gallons of jet fuel. For the passengers and crew of Flight 11, the horror was intimate and confusing. In the lower cabin, flight attendants were making breathless calls to the ground, reporting stabbings and the use of mace. But in the front of the plane, where David and Lynn sat, the reality was likely immediate and brutal. We will never know exactly what David Angell saw or thought in those final 20 minutes. Did he hold Lynn's hand? Did he think of the scripts sitting on his desk in Los Angeles? The plane made a sharp turn south, following the Hudson River, a corridor that leads directly to the heart of Manhattan. The descent was rapid. At 460 miles per hour, the massive aircraft roared over the unsuspecting city. To the people on the streets of New York, it was a terrifying anomaly, a commercial airliner flying dangerously low, its engines screaming. For David Angell, a man whose life's work was about finding the humor in the human condition, the final moments were a plunge into the absolute abyss of human cruelty. At 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The impact point was between the 93rd and 99th floors. David and Lynn, seated near the front of the aircraft, would have been killed instantly, their lives extinguished in the first terrifying second of an event that would ignite a global war. The tragedy of David Angell is often lost in the sheer scale of 9/11. When nearly 3,000 people die in a single morning, individual stories tend to blur into a monolith of grief. But the loss of David Angell was a specific, jagged wound for the entertainment industry. The production of Frasier shut down. The cast and crew who looked to David as a father figure were paralyzed with shock. The laughter that he had manufactured so effortlessly suddenly felt foreign, choked off by the ash and dust settling over lower Manhattan.
It was a stark reminder that culture, art, and comedy are fragile things, easily crushed by the brute force of hatred.
In the days that followed, tributes poured in, but they felt inadequate against the magnitude of the violation. The Angell name was later memorialized in the Frasier finale, a quiet nod to the empty chair at the writer's table. He was a man who built a legacy on words, yet he died in an event that left the entire world speechless. His death wasn't just the loss of a producer, it was the loss of a sensibility, a gentle, intelligent humor that the world desperately needed in the dark years that followed. David Angell was a passenger on a flight that changed history, a victim of a new kind of war. But aviation has been claiming the lives of Hollywood's daredevils long before the era of terrorism. We must now turn the clock back to the infancy of flight, to a time when planes were made of canvas and wire, and the danger came not from hijackers, but from the hubris of the industry itself. We travel back to the silent era, to 1920, where the very first stunt king of Hollywood, a man who walked on wings for a living and treated gravity as a suggestion, found himself in a night shoot that went horribly wrong. He wasn't killed by a bomb or a storm, he was killed by the very thing that made him a star, the blinding, hypnotic glare of the Hollywood spotlight. Number 7. Ormer Locklear. In the sterilized, safety-obsessed world of modern cinema, where actors perform in front of green screens and digital wizards conjure danger from the comfort of a desk, it is difficult to comprehend the raw, unhinged reality of 1920s Hollywood. This was an era before unions, before regulations, and before the concept of acceptable risk. In this wild frontier, Ormer Locklear wasn't just a stuntman, he was a god of gravity. He is widely credited as the man who invented wing walking. During World War I, legend has it that Locklear would climb out of his cockpit in mid-air to fix mechanical issues on the fly simply because he didn't want to land. When the war ended, he brought that terrifying nonchalance to Tinseltown. Locklear was the original daredevil, the prototype for every Tom Cruise and Jackie Chan who would follow. He didn't use safety harnesses or parachutes. He relied on grip strength, balance, and a complete absence of fear. Hollywood fell in love with him instantly. He was handsome, charismatic, and he offered audiences something they had never seen, actual mortal danger. He became the star of The Skywayman, a silent film built entirely around his aerial acrobatics. The studio marketed him as the man who laughs at death, a title that was as much a challenge to fate as it was a promotional tagline. On the night of August 2, 1920, Locklear was preparing for the final stunt of the film at the DeMille Airfield in Los Angeles. It was a night shoot, a rarity at the time, adding a layer of complexity to an already perilous setup. The script called for a death dive. Locklear and his co-pilot Milton Skeets Elliott were to put their Jenny biplane into a steep spin, dropping from the darkness toward the ground, simulating a crash. The plan was to pull out of the dive at the last possible second, skimming the earth to thrill the camera. But the difference between a thrill and a tragedy in aviation is often a matter of perception, and that night, perception would be their undoing. The airfield was bathed in the harsh, artificial glare of high-intensity carbon arc searchlights. These massive beams were necessary to illuminate the plane for the cameras in the pitch-black sky. On the ground, Locklear's girlfriend, the famous silent film actress Viola Dana, watched anxiously. She had seen him perform death-defying feats 100 times, but there was an ominous energy to this particular shoot. The air was thick with oil smoke and the nervous anticipation of the crew. Locklear and Elliott ascended into the night, their plane disappearing into the void above the lights. At the designated signal, they initiated the spin. The aircraft tipped over and began its corkscrew descent, the engine whining in protest as gravity took hold. Down they came, faster and faster, a spinning blur of canvas and wood. The director and the camera operators held their breath, waiting for the pullout. The searchlights tracked the plane, creating a cone of blinding luminescence. And that was the fatal flaw.
As Locklear plummeted toward the earth, the powerful searchlights meant to capture his glory instead blinded him completely. The brilliance of the beams washed out the ground, destroying his depth perception. He couldn't see the horizon, he couldn't see the runway, he could only see a wall of white light. He likely believed he had more altitude, more time to correct the dive. He didn't. The plane never leveled off. It slammed into the ground at full speed, crashing into a sludge pit used to store waste oil. The impact was sickeningly loud, followed immediately by the silence of shock. The stunt had gone perfectly, right up until the moment it became a catastrophe.
Number 7. Ormer Locklear. In the sterilized, safety-obsessed world of modern cinema, where actors perform in front of green screens and digital wizards conjure danger from the comfort of a desk, it is difficult to comprehend the raw, unhinged reality of 1920s Hollywood. This was an era before unions, before regulations, and before the concept of acceptable risk. In this wild frontier, Ormer Locklear wasn't just a stuntman, he was a god of gravity. He is widely credited as the man who invented wing walking. During World War I, legend has it that Locklear would climb out of his cockpit in mid-air to fix mechanical issues on the fly, simply because he didn't want to land. When the war ended, he brought that terrifying nonchalance to Tinseltown. Locklear was the original daredevil, the prototype for every Tom Cruise and Jackie Chan who would follow. He didn't use safety harnesses or parachutes. He relied on grip strength, balance, and a complete absence of fear. Hollywood fell in love with him instantly. He was handsome, charismatic, and he offered audiences something they had never seen: actual, mortal danger. He became the star of The Skywayman, a silent film built entirely around his aerial acrobatics. The studio marketed him as the man who laughs at death, a title that was as much a challenge to fate as it was a promotional tagline. On the night of August 2, 1920, Locklear was preparing for the final stunt of the film at the DeMille Airfield in Los Angeles. It was a night shoot, a rarity at the time, adding a layer of complexity to an already perilous setup. The script called for a death dive. Locklear and his co-pilot, Milton Elliott, were to put their Jenny biplane into a steep spin, dropping from the darkness toward the ground, simulating a crash. The plan was to pull out of the dive at the last possible second, skimming the earth to thrill the camera. But the difference between a thrill and a tragedy in aviation is often a matter of perception, and that night, perception would be their undoing.
Number 8. Mike DeGruy. There are men who look at the map of the world and see only the blank spaces, the unclimbed peaks and the unplumbed depths. Mike DeGruy was one of those rare souls. He was not a Hollywood star in the traditional sense. You wouldn't find him walking the red carpet in a tuxedo, preening for the paparazzi. But if you have ever watched a high-end nature documentary, if you have ever sat in awe of the alien beauty of the deep ocean in series like Blue Planet or the films of James Cameron, you have seen the world through Mike DeGruy's eyes. He was an award-winning cinematographer and a biologist, a man with an infectious manic energy who could make a tube worm seem as charismatic as a movie star. He had survived shark attacks that left his arm mangled. He had dived into active volcanoes. He had descended into the crushing blackness of the abyss. He was a man who had made a career out of surviving the most hostile environments on Earth. In February 2012, DeGruy was in New South Wales, Australia. He was there for a mission that was nothing short of historic. He was working alongside his close friend and creative partner, Andrew White, the writer and producer of the survival film Sanctum, on a project for James Cameron and National Geographic. They were preparing for the Deep-Sea Challenger expedition, Cameron's record-breaking solo dive to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. DeGruy and White were the documentarians, the storytellers entrusted with capturing this monumental feat of human endurance. The mood was electric. They were on the verge of making history. On February 4th, the two men arrived at the small rural airstrip of Jasper's Brush, a quiet patch of tarmac surrounded by the lush green of the Australian bush. They weren't strapping into a submersible or donning dive gear. They were simply climbing into a helicopter to scout locations. It was a mundane task in a life filled with extraordinary risks. The aircraft was a Robinson R-44, a popular light helicopter often called the Toyota Camry of the skies for its ubiquity. Andrew White, an experienced pilot who was just as comfortable in the air as he was underwater, took the controls. DeGruy strapped into the passenger seat. They were two explorers in their element, likely discussing camera angles and logistics, unaware that the danger wasn't waiting for them in the depths of the Pacific, but right there, hovering a few feet above the grass.
The takeoff procedure for a helicopter is a delicate ballet of aerodynamics, a fight against gravity that requires all systems to function in perfect harmony. Witnesses at the airstrip watched as the rotor blades blurred into a disc and the skids lifted gently off the ground. The helicopter hovered for a moment, a standard check before transitioning to forward flight. Everything appeared normal, but as Wright attempted to climb out, something catastrophic occurred. The precise mechanics of the failure are often debated, whether it was a sudden loss of power, a mechanical seizure, or a gust of wind catching the tail, but the result was instantaneous and terrifying. The helicopter didn't soar, it pitched violently. At an altitude of roughly 10 meters, hardly higher than a two-story house, the machine became a dead weight. It nosedived into the ground just beside the runway. In the world of aviation, a crash from 10 meters is often survivable. The cabin of a modern helicopter is designed to crumple, absorbing the energy of the impact. But the R-44 had a fatal flaw in its design concerning the fuel tanks, a vulnerability that had been the subject of safety warnings. Upon impact, the fuel tanks compromised. The crash itself was a heavy metallic crunch, but it was the silence that followed that was the most chilling. A silence that lasted only a heartbeat before the fuel ignited. The wreckage was instantly consumed by a ferocious localized inferno. It wasn't a slow burn, it was an explosion of heat that gave no quarter. Bystanders and emergency crews rushed to the scene, driven by the desperate hope of pulling the men from the wreckage, but the intensity of the flames was a physical wall. They could do nothing but watch. The man who had survived the crushing pressure of the ocean and the teeth of sharks was trapped in a cage of fire on a quiet Sunday morning in the countryside. When the fire was finally extinguished, the loss was absolute. Mike DeGruy and Andrew White were gone. The news devastated the exploration and filmmaking communities. James Cameron, a man known for his stoicism, was broken. He released a statement calling them his deep-sea brothers, men who possessed the true spirit of the explorer. The deep-sea Challenger expedition, which was days away from launching, was almost canceled. The team was paralyzed by grief. But they ultimately decided to proceed, dedicating the dive to Mike and Andrew, carrying their names down to the deepest point on Earth, a place they would have given anything to see. The investigation into the crash revealed the cruel randomness of the event. It highlighted the risks of the Robinson helicopter's fuel system, leading to mandatory retrofits worldwide, a legacy of safety bought with their lives. But for those who knew DeGruy, the tragedy was steeped in irony. He had spent his life filming the most dangerous predators on the planet, teaching the world that the ocean wasn't a place to be feared, but a place to be understood. He respected the shark, the squid, and the whale. He knew the risks of the deep. It seemed fundamentally unfair that a man of the water should perish by fire, in a machine he was using just to get to work. His footage remains his monument. Every time you see a killer whale beach itself to snatch a seal in slow motion, or a vampire squid turn itself inside out, you are seeing the legacy of Mike DeGruy. He was a conduit for wonder, extinguished by a mechanical failure that cared nothing for his passion. But while DeGruy was a behind-the-scenes legend, our next subject was a man who lived to be seen. We leave the modern tragedy of the Australian bush and return to the golden, reckless age of aviation stunts in the 1930s. We go to the Cleveland Air Show, a spectacle of noise and danger, where a Hollywood stunt pilot, famous for his work on the movie Hell's Angels, performed a maneuver so dangerous that his death didn't just shock the crowd, it forced the government to rewrite the laws of the sky.
Number 9. Al Wilson.
In the 1930s, aviation was not a science. It was a spectator sport. It was a blood sport, played out in the arenas of the sky for the amusement of roaring crowds who paid good money to see men cheat death. At the center of this adrenaline-fueled circus were the barnstormers, pilots who traveled the country performing loops, spins, and wing walks in rickety biplanes held together by little more than piano wire and prayer. Among this breed of daredevils, Al Wilson was royalty. He was a man who didn't just fly planes, he wrestled them. He was a Hollywood stunt pilot, a veteran of the screen who had flown in the legendary and notoriously deadly production of Howard Hughes' Hell's Angels. That film had claimed the lives of 3 pilots during production, but Wilson had walked away unscathed. He carried an aura of invincibility, a swagger that suggested the laws of physics were merely guidelines he could choose to ignore. In September 1932, Al Wilson arrived in Cleveland, Ohio for the National Air Races. This was the Super Bowl of aviation, a week-long festival of speed and noise that drew hundreds of thousands of spectators. Wilson wasn't there to race, he was there to perform. He had been hired to fly a replica of a 1910 Curtiss Pusher, a primitive, fragile aircraft that looked more like a motorized box kite than a plane. The stunt was billed as a nostalgia dogfight. Wilson, flying this ancient relic, was scripted to engage in a mock aerial battle with an autogyro, a strange hybrid aircraft that was the predecessor to the helicopter, flown by another pilot, John Miller. The script called for close passes, erratic maneuvering, and a thrilling display of old versus new. The crowd at the Cleveland grandstands was buzzing with anticipation. They wanted spectacle, and Al Wilson was the master of delivering it. But there is a dark psychology to the air show. The crowd cheers for the skill, but they hold their breath for the danger. As Wilson taxied the Curtiss Pusher onto the grass field, the frail wooden frame shuddering under the vibration of the engine, he was performing for an audience that was hungry for a thrill. He took off into the hazy Ohio sky, the wind whipping through the open cockpit, ready to execute a dance that required absolute precision in a machine that was barely airworthy. He was a Hollywood pro used to hitting his marks, but the sky over Cleveland that day was about to go off script.
As the stunt began, the 2 aircraft circled each other like boxers in a ring. The Curtiss Pusher, with its propeller facing backward and the pilot sitting exposed in the front, was a difficult beast to control. It lacked the power and stability of modern aircraft. The autogyro, with its spinning rotor blades, hovered and weaved. The choreography required Wilson to dive at the autogyro, simulating an attack, and then pull away at the last second. It was a game of chicken played at 300 feet. The crowd roared as Wilson brought the Pusher around for a pass. He banked the fragile plane, pushing the nose down, aiming for the autogyro. But as he closed the distance, the margin for error vanished. Perhaps it was a gust of wind, perhaps a mechanical hiccup in the primitive controls, or perhaps the sheer turbulence created by the autogyro's rotor blades. Whatever the cause, the 2 aircraft collided. The impact was not a massive explosion, but a sickening crunch of wood and fabric. The Curtiss Pusher's wing clipped the rotor of the autogyro. In an instant, the delicate balance of flight was destroyed. The autogyro managed to limp away, its pilot fighting for control, but Wilson's plane was doomed. The Pusher disintegrated. It didn't glide, it tumbled. To the horror of the thousands watching in the stands, the aircraft simply folded in on itself. Wilson, strapped into the open seat, was a passenger on a piece of falling debris. The crash was visible to everyone, a stark, brutal plummet into the ground directly in front of the grandstands. There was no fire, just the awful final thud of impact and the cloud of dust that rose up to obscure the wreckage. The cheers of the crowd were instantly strangled, replaced by a collective gasp, and then a hushed, terrified silence. The invincible stuntman, the survivor of Hell's Angels, lay broken in a pile of sticks and canvas on the manicured grass of the airfield.
Rescuers pulled Wilson from the wreckage alive, but his injuries were catastrophic. He had suffered severe head trauma and internal injuries. He was rushed to a local hospital where he lingered in a coma for 2 days before succumbing to his wounds. He was 36 years old. His death sent a shockwave through the aviation world. The national air races, often criticized for their reckless promotion of danger, came under intense scrutiny. The crash of Al Wilson wasn't just a tragedy, it was a turning point. It signaled the end of the Wild West era of air shows. Following his death, the rules governing aerobatic displays were tightened significantly. The Civil Aeronautics Authority began to crack down on the kind of low-level, high-risk dogfighting stunts that had killed him. Wilson died as a martyr to spectacle. He was a man who lived to entertain, to bring the magic of Hollywood danger to a live audience, but he paid the ultimate price for their ticket. He proved that while you can script a movie and you can edit a scene, you cannot negotiate with gravity in real time. His death closed the chapter on the romantic, chaotic age of the barnstormer, ushering in a more regulated, albeit less colorful, era of aviation. But while Al Wilson was a seasoned professional who knew exactly the risks he was taking every time he strapped into a cockpit, our final story is the most heartbreaking of them all. It involves a pilot who didn't know the risks, not because she was reckless, but because she was a child. We travel forward to 1996, to a rainy morning in Wyoming, where a media frenzy, a father's ambition, and a nation's obsession with breaking records combined to place a 7-year-old girl at the controls of an aircraft, leading to a tragedy so preventable and so profound that it forced the United States government to make it illegal for a child to ever try to be a hero in the sky again. Number 10. Jessica Dubroff. The allure of the record breaker is a potent drug in American culture. We love the youngest, the fastest, the first. But sometimes this obsession blinds us to the most basic instincts of protection. In April 1996, the media found its new darling in a 7-year-old girl named Jessica Dubroff. She was a cherubic, blue-eyed child from California who had a singular, terrifying ambition: to become the youngest person to fly an airplane across the United States. She was not a prodigy, she was a first grader. She didn't even have a driver's license, yet she was being marketed as a pilot. The press ate it up. They dubbed her the pint-sized pilot. She wore a pink baseball cap and sat on a booster seat so she could see over the instrument panel, her feet barely reaching the rudder pedals extensions. It was a spectacle that was equal parts heartwarming and horrifying. The driving force behind this venture was her father, Lloyd Dubroff, and her flight instructor, Joe Reed. The plan was a sea to shining sea voyage, a multi-stop cross-country hop that would dominate the news cycle. Technically, it wasn't an official record. Guinness had long since stopped recognizing youngest pilot records for fear of encouraging exactly this kind of danger, but that didn't stop the publicity machine. The media was complicit, treating this dangerous stunt as a human interest fluff piece. Jessica was interviewed on national television, looking tired and overwhelmed, repeating rehearsed lines about the joy of flight while clutching a stuffed animal. On the morning of April 11, 1996, the trio was in Cheyenne, Wyoming. They were scheduled to fly to Lincoln, Nebraska, the next leg of their journey. But the weather in Cheyenne was turning ugly. A storm was brewing, bringing with it cold rain, gusty winds, and heavy, leaden clouds. At the airport, seasoned pilots were staying on the ground, drinking coffee, waiting for the front to pass. But the schedule was tight. The media was waiting in Lincoln. The pressure to perform, to keep the momentum of the record alive, was suffocating. Lloyd Dubroff, eager to keep the cameras rolling, decided they would fly. Jessica, a tired 7-year-old girl, was strapped into the left seat of the single-engine Cessna 177 Cardinal. She was the pilot in command, a title that was legally impossible, but marketing gold. Cheyenne Regional Airport sits at an elevation of over 6,000 feet. In aviation, high altitude combined with low pressure creates a condition known as high-density altitude. It means the air is thin. It robs the engine of power and the wings of lift. A plane that climbs easily at sea level feels sluggish and heavy in the thin mountain air.
Add to this a plane loaded with 3 people, full fuel and luggage, and you have a recipe for disaster. As they taxied to runway 30, the rain began to turn into sleet. The wind was erratic. The conditions were shouting, "Stop!" but the throttle was pushed forward. The Cessna began its roll. It felt heavy. It ate up thousands of feet of asphalt, struggling to gain flying speed. Finally, reluctantly, it lifted off the ground, but it didn't soar. It clawed at the air, its nose pitched dangerously high as it fought to climb out of the soup. Jessica was at the controls with Joe Reed beside her, likely shadowing her movements on the dual controls. But physics is indifferent to who is holding the yoke. As the plane climbed to maybe 400 feet, the speed bled away. The heavy, sluggish aircraft stalled. A stall is not an engine failure, it is the wing stopping to fly. The smooth flow of air over the wing breaks, and the lift vanishes. The Cessna, heavy and slow, rolled sharply to the right. It didn't glide, it fell. To the horror of the onlookers and the camera crews who had gathered to film a triumphant departure, the plane plummeted nose first toward a residential street. It happened in slow motion, and then all at once. The aircraft slammed into the pavement of Cornegay Court, just a mile from the runway. The silence of the morning was shattered by the crunch of metal and the sickening thud of impact. There was no fire, but the force of the collision was unsurvivable. The fuselage was crushed, the dreams of a record-breaking flight instantly converted into a pile of twisted wreckage on a wet suburban street.
The first responders who arrived at the scene found a tragedy that would haunt them forever. All 3 occupants, Jessica, her father Lloyd, and instructor Joe Reed, were dead. Jessica Dubroff, the little girl in the pink hat who just wanted to fly, was gone. The shock was immediate and national. The footage of the crash played on the evening news, a grim snuff film that forced America to look in the mirror. The human interest story had curdled into a grotesque indictment of adult ambition and media hunger. The investigation by the NTSB was scathing. It cited the decision to take off in poor weather, the heavy aircraft, and the high-density altitude as the causes. But the real cause was clear to everyone. A child had been placed in a situation she had no business being in. The public outrage was palpable. Questions were asked in Congress. How was this allowed to happen? Why did we cheer for a 7-year-old doing a job that requires adult judgment? In the wake of the tragedy, President Bill Clinton signed the Child Pilot Safety Act into law. It made it illegal for a person without a valid pilot certificate, which requires one to be at least 16 or 17 years old, to manipulate the controls of an aircraft if the flight is attempting to set a record. Jessica's legacy was a law that ensured no other child would die chasing a record that shouldn't exist. Her death marked the end of an era of innocence in aviation stunts. It reminded us that the sky is a ruthless environment that demands respect, maturity, and judgment, things a 7-year-old, no matter how brave, simply does not possess. The wreckage was cleared from Carnegie Court long ago, but the ghost of Flight 777 and the little girl in the booster seat remains a somber warning. From the freezing waters of the English Channel to the fiery streets of Mexico, and finally to a rainy road in Wyoming, these stories remind us that while Hollywood stars may seem immortal on the silver screen, in the air they are just souls on board, subject to the same fragile fate as the rest of us.